Okay, I think we can start now. Thanks for joining us today. Can everyone hear me all right? Okay, cool. Welcome to today's webinar, Learning at Lunch. Today, we will hear from Pippa Jones on the international perspective on carbon farming. My name is Razak Sarkar. I'm the Land Service Officer in the Sustainable Agriculture team from Northwest Local Land Services. Also, I'm the project manager for the Valuing Natural Assets on the farm. The webinar is supported by the Australian government through funding from the Natural Heritage Trust under the Climate Smart Agriculture program. Sorry, I think what I've missed. Start presenting. Yep. Yep. So this webinar is supported by the Australian government through funding from the Natural Heritage Trust under the Climate Smart Agriculture program. The acknowledgement. Local Land Services acknowledges that it stands on the country which always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and waters, and we show our respect for the elders past, present, and emerging. We are committed to providing a place in which Aboriginal people are included socially, culturally, and economically through the thoughtful and collaborative approaches to our work. So just a bit of a housekeeping for today's webinar. This session will be recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel for viewing later. We'll also email you the recorded version for your convenience. We encourage that you ask questions throughout the session using the QA function on the top of your screen, not the chat function. We'll have a QA session after the end of the presentation. We'll then answer these questions during the QA session. There will be a feedback survey. We want to capture information about your knowledge base before the start of the presentation. So please fill out the pre-event survey, which will show you before the start of the presentation. And there will be a post-event survey as well, which will show you after the QA session. We value your feedback, and this helps us to deliver the content you like to see in the future. We developed a fact sheet covering key points and links for further resources. Which will be emailed to you after the webinar. Our today's speaker is Pippa Jones. Pippa is the Node Manager for the Southern Queensland and Northern NSW Innovation Hub. She has 17 years of experience in natural resource management and sustainable agriculture extension and is a 2024 Nuffield Scholar. Pippa is using her Nuffield Scholarship to explore the ways farmers engage in carbon farming around the world, including whether monitoring, measuring, and managing carbon is good for business. I will now go on hand over to our today's speaker, Pippa Jones, but we'll do the quick pre-event survey, and then we'll hand over to Pippa.
Am I right to begin now, Razak?
Yep. Over to you. Do you mind sharing your screen? And I will stop sharing now. And over to you, Pippa. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. Just while I share my screen, it's lovely to see so many familiar not faces. I won't see you. So many familiar names on the call today, and just waiting for technology to do its thing. And I did see that most people have a good understanding of carbon farming. So I hope that today I can impart some knowledge on you. So thanks, Razak. That was a really great introduction. As many of you know, I've worked a lot with natural resource management over the last 20 years. I am currently working with the University of Southern Queensland and the Southern Queensland Northern New South Wales Drought Resilience and Innovation Hub, which is a mouthful, but it's essentially extending information and connecting landholders and industry with resources around drought management. So that's my day job. But what I did largely in 2024 was spend some time traveling the world in my Nuffield Scholarship, which was around trying to get a better understanding of how farmers are engaging in carbon farming globally, because we all know, I mean, I'm a farmer, but I also work with farmers, and we know that carbon is contentious, it's confusing. Words like net zero, low emissions agriculture, carbon neutrality, emissions reduction, sequestration are thrown around a lot. And sometimes it's really hard to be able to link that with what we do in our day-to-day. So I was keen to sort of travel and try and understand better what was happening overseas, because I figured that surely someone had worked this out overseas. I'm not so sure they have. But anyway, for the next little while, I'll share some of my learnings with you, and feel free to use the Q&A or the chat box to ask questions. And Razak will be my trusted checker of questions, so I can hopefully answer that as we go. So there's a lot of green on that map. They're all the countries I visited last year. But in truth, I barely scratched the surface when it comes to trying to understand how farmers are engaging in carbon farming. I think it's varied across the world. But as you'll see through my presentation, there's actually also a lot of similarities with how we think and how we engage. And so I found that sort of the side of it really, really interesting. So how are farmers engaging? This probably isn't news to some of you on the call, or many of you on the call, but they're either engaging through things like the carbon market, like the ACCU scheme, which we have here in Australia, or by measuring, monitoring and managing carbon footprint on farm. And so one thing I remember when I started my research, when I first started looking into applying for a Nuffield Scholarship, I figured that every single country in the world had an ACCU scheme, just like we did, a government backed or a government initiated program to mean that people can earn and trade in carbon credits. Actually, the ACCU scheme is quite unique. There are some other examples globally, and I'll go into those later, but the Australian system is quite unique in that sense. But yeah, internationally, I also found that farmers are measuring and managing their carbon footprint for a variety of reasons. But to break it down into why they're doing it and what they're doing, this is what they're doing. So what are they doing? I found some farmers are doing soil testing, so they've got a much better understanding of soil organic carbon, the baseline level, and then being able to manage that in the future through ongoing testing. Rotational grazing through water and wire. Recent publications have shown that if you do rotational grazing, you can improve soil organic carbon. Herd productivity improvement. So if you're looking at buying genetics where you can reduce the gestation period of your female, or you've got a better average daily weight gain of a steer at 200 and 400 days, those sorts of activities mean you're reducing emissions. People are using solar energy on farms. They're reducing inputs or using alternative inputs. So if we're looking at fertiliser use, which is the largest emissions source for a lot of cropping enterprises, they're using natural fertilisers, or they're using nitrogen inhibiting fertilisers. Cover cropping, planting trees on farms, obviously selling carbon credits, and in some cases farmers are using carbon calculators to report their sustainability metrics. amongst other. This isn't exhaustive, but this is a fairly good representation of what I saw. So I talked before about engaging farmers in carbon markets and measuring your carbon footprint, essentially. So a few examples I found engaging carbon markets is in the USA, in Montana, where there was an organisation called the Western Sustainability Exchange, and they work with farmers to manage grazing to, and then engage in a carbon project through a company called Native, and they use the Vera method. So if you are aware, Australia, we have the ACCU scheme. Internationally, there's also Vera, and there's also the gold standard, and they're two of the probably the most well-known and common international schemes for using methodologies to engage in carbon markets. So and then it's interesting, in the USA, the farmers who are using soil carbon projects, the period of that agreement is 40 years. So in Australia, it's 25 years, sometimes 100, but generally it's 25 or 100 years as under the ACCU scheme. In the States, under that Vera method for the soil carbon projects, it was a 40-year agreement period, which is a really long time. And often in the cases I saw, the Native, which was the service provider that delivered the agreements with farmers, they would actually pay for the water and the wire, for example, and in order for farmers to participate. I can't make comment on, I didn't ask what percentage as it does Native then take of that carbon credit at the end when those carbon credits are issued, or what does that look like? Thanks, Razak. I've been in this world too long. What does that look like in an agreement point of view if the service provider are putting up the funds to buy the fencing material, for example? But for the farmers there, they said without that we couldn't prioritise being involved in these projects. And then I visited a massive ranch called Matador Ranch and Cattle. They have 380,000 acres, about 12,000 head of cattle in Montana, and they registered 2 carbon projects in July 2023 with the Climate Action Reserve to sequester soil carbon. And they actually took 280 soil samples, which they will retest in 5 years so that they can then be issued with and trade in carbon credits is the long-term game. But part of that was also understanding what their soil carbon levels are, and then being able to use that information so they can improve decision making, and also use the additionality of water and wire and having fencing and water points as part of that grazing project to improve their productivity and profitability. And in Canada, interestingly, it had one of the first carbon markets in 2008, the Alberta Emissions Offset Scheme, so the province of Alberta, set up that scheme so that they could offset the province's oil and gas industry. So if you've ever been to Alberta, you will know that the landscape is just dotted with oil and gas rigs, and it's just part of living where they live. So it was a really early scheme. I think there's sort of mixed messages or mixed feelings from farmers as to whether they benefit from that. I think there probably wasn't the scientific rigour behind it that there is, for example, today with the Australian Carbon Credit Unit scheme. But it was a good place to start. I think they had a lot of learnings from that, and it's a good example of one of the earlier carbon markets that existed at a provincial or level. So I went to Vietnam as well, which actually doesn't have a carbon market yet, but the Vietnamese government wants to introduce a global voluntary carbon market by 2028. So part of the reason I was over there was to try and understand some of those barriers that farmers are facing around engagement and what some of the emissions are in their part of the world and sequestration opportunities. And so I joined a team of Australian and Vietnamese researchers who were part of the project they were leaving was called Carbon in Focus, which was about developing informed science-based carbon market research so that when carbon markets come to Vietnam, the farmers and their advisors are better informed and better engaged. And so they know what questions to ask. They understand where the emissions on their rice farms come from, but also understand the sorts of questions they can ask, they should be asking about reporting, monitoring and verification. So it was funny, I went to a carbon forum with a heap of Department of Agriculture staff who are the extension officers, and it was in the Mekong Delta, and they were asking lots of questions around carbon markets that we ask in Australia. So how much do I get for a carbon credit? How long does it take? What percentage of credits does the company, the service provider, take? It was very similar to sitting in a Australian field day and having farmers ask exactly the same question. So in that case, we aren't so different after all. And in the UK, interestingly, it has two codes. So it doesn't have a big scheme like we do in Australia. It had the Peatland Restoration Code and the Woodland Code. And a English farmer said to me, because I was asking about it, he said, Pip, we've got the Sustainable Farming Incentive, which is essentially a scheme that rewards farmers financially by implementing activities on farm that boost biodiversity, but also productivity. So, for example, they'll have to do soil management plans, hedgerows, buffer strips, nitrogen management plans. There's a whole raft of activities you can do, and you get paid for those. And if you do the same activity on the same piece of land, you get paid twice for doing that. So we could call it a subsidy. And they said to me, why would I do a carbon market when I can much more easily be involved in the Sustainable Farming Incentive? And so I think that really reflects maybe why the difference, I think, between Australian uptake of carbon markets and potentially UK, because when there are alternatives for farmers to get engaged in that are easier and cheaper and more rewarding, then that's what they're going to do. So I talked about, well, is it good for business? And this is what I sort of would come back to a lot. Obviously, if you've got a carbon market, you've got an alternative income stream. But like I said before, by doing those additional activities that are a requirement under your agreement, you will have improved soil health. And if you have improved soil health, assuming you get that increase in soil organic carbon, then you're going to have improved ground cover, improved carrying capacity, and improved productivity, improved profitability. And I've just put here that funding through the carbon service provider helped prioritise infrastructure, which is that example I had in Montana. So the other part that farmers are engaging with are measuring and managing their carbon footprint. So in Canada, I met with some farmers and some industry bodies who were delivering or recipients of funding through the On-Farm Climate Action Fund, which is a 704 million Canadian dollars over 4 years to support farmers to reduce emissions or sequester carbon on farm. So farmers could apply for funding of up to 85% of the costs of that program to do three things. One was implement rotational grazing. One was manage nitrogen emissions through managing fertilizer application, and the third one was about implementing cover cropping. So you could apply for funding and you could implement those programs, and the Canadian government would support that. And so having access to that funding really made sure that farmers could prioritise those activities. I also met a farmer who was a potato farmer in Alberta. He supplied to McCain's, and he reported his scope 1 and 2 emissions to McCain as part of the requirement. Now, he didn't get a price premium for doing that, but he thought by doing that he would get preferential treatment in the future. And I do wonder if that's sort of happened yet, or if it's coming. But he also used that data to be able to inform some of those efficiencies he could make. So if you're able to look at data year on year using the same metrics, then being able to understand, well, where have I done well? Where can I make improvements? That was one of the benefits of doing that. In the UK, I met with some consultants. Their job was to work one-on-one with farmers to measure your carbon footprint. So Dawn Dunbier is a big beef processor, and Arla is a big organic dairy, a Danish organic dairy. They had pilot programs where consultants would work one-on-one with farmers to measure their carbon footprint, and then part of that was helping that farmer identify those efficiencies, those gaps, where can they improve. And I thought that is a really a useful process to go through, however, really costly as well. And I talked about earlier about Matador Ranch and Cattle, which had the carbon projects, but they were also doing a whole lot of soil testing. So they're not measuring the carbon footprint per se, but they're measuring soil carbon. And they had done an Asparagopsis trial a few years, or probably 5 years ago. Asparagopsis is comes from seaweed. It's meant to reduce emissions, methane emissions from cows. And so they were sort of engaged in those ways. So Uruguay was another place I went to. It was a really interesting place. Beef is key to the culture of that country. They don't have a ministry of agriculture. They have a ministry of livestock. And beef is their second biggest export. So there are no legally binding net zero targets for Uruguay, unlike a lot of other countries. However, because so much of their agricultural produce is sent overseas, is exported, I think more than 80% last time I checked, it's really important for the government and for industry to try and work with farmers to improve the way they manage the land, whether that's through moving from set stocking to rotational grazing to improve ground cover and soil health and sequester carbon, or whether that's looking at herd improvements, talking about pre-testing animals and culling your empty cows, because that is a way that they can make improvements in herd efficiencies and productivity. And so regardless of the fact that they have net zero or not, they still are working towards those goals because international markets are asking that. And I think as well, because internationally they would have a lot of investment into Uruguay. And so having those targets gives those actions in place gives some security or some confidence to investors. I visited a carbon neutral beef farm, which was really interesting. So they had the second carbon neutral certified beef farm in Uruguay. They exported 10% of their beef to Switzerland as a price premium. The rest went to China. But that, in order to get to that carbon neutrality, they implemented a whole range of activities, including part of it was improving how they're managing their herd, and part of it was including managing how their pasture. So they were doing rotational grazing, and they were able to increase their productivity by 19% over a few years by doing that. So, and Vietnam, I'll touch on Vietnam again. I talked about the carbon market side of it. The Vietnamese government does have net zero by 2050. It's embedded in their climate change strategy for 2050. And the federal government has a policy or a program called 1 million hectares of low emissions sustainable rice. So in Vietnam, your average rice farm is 1 hectare in size. The area I visited was the Mekong Delta, which is highly susceptible to climate change, and where 80% of your farmers are rice farmers. So it's pretty ambitious of the government to set that program and that up to support farmers. But key to that is really engaging with and informing the advisors that work with those farmers, who are the Department of Ag extension officers. And I think it's a ambitious project, and yeah, education around that sort of those abatement opportunities and that sequestration opportunities is key to success in that area. So again, I'm linking it back to, is it good for business? I think if you can do activities that improve soil health, and then you're going to have knock-on effects with productivity and profitability. Obviously, funding through, for example, the Canadian On-Farm Climate Action Program is helping farmers prioritise infrastructure. Farmers having year-on-year data is helping them identify knowledge gaps and inform decision-making. And in some cases, there's price premiums or market access that are some of the benefits. So I've sort of summarised it into a bit of a table there, which I think we can look at all these reasons why people do what they do. But at the end of the day, a lot of the time, not every time, a lot of the time it comes back to those productivity and profitability gains for the longer term, rather than looking on the short-term win. So there's obviously a whole lot of reasons why farmers don't engage and are sceptical. There's a lot of that. Time and cost is huge. It's fairly universal, and it's no surprise. The trust thing comes up a lot. I mean, it comes up a lot here in Australia as well. We don't know who to trust. We don't know what to trust. We're still getting mixed messages. It's a lot. It's complex. It's evolving. This information is contentious. Knowledge gaps. I mean, there's knowledge gaps amongst farmers. There's knowledge gaps amongst their advisors. There's knowledge gaps at a government and policy level, and so that doesn't help. And it's not urgent. So if my bank isn't asking for it, or my supply chain aren't asking for this information, then why would I bother spending time doing it? So one thing I did discover as well is that globally, it doesn't matter where you live, what region you're in, what country, there's some similar issues that will influence how things are taken up. And so if we think about policy, framework and models, culture, history, and climate, and I'll use the example of the frameworks and models is quite obvious. I talked before about how in England they have the sustainable farming incentive. So why would you do a carbon market? I would argue that the reason that the ACCU scheme is so widely taken up in Australia is because it is it's such a it's a government-led scheme, and it does have a lot more science behind it, and it's much more robust than probably some of the other international schemes. But on the flip side, I wonder if our climate in Australia means that there's less people taking that up, purely because those of us that live west of the divide, we are in a drier climate that is very unpredictable. And I know in Scotland, I didn't visit Scotland, but I have some contacts in Scotland who I talk to regularly. And I was talking with someone the other day, and they said she thinks up to 75% of farmers in Scotland will have done their carbon audit, which links back to the whole subsidy program. So in Scotland, in order to access basic subsidy schemes, you need to do a whole farm plan. And part of that whole farm plan, there's a range of 5 things you need to do. One of those things is a carbon audit. So obviously, people engaging in Scotland and doing their carbon audit is happening at scale so that farmers can access that subsidy. But I wonder how many farmers would do it if they didn't have it linked to the subsidy. And also, I'm interested to know year on year, if you are doing your carbon audit every year or every few years, how is that information improving how you look at your farm and your farm business and making decisions with that? And a little differently, but I'm going to use this one. Another example from Scotland, which links to the culture. So recently, the Scottish government, which sits very separately from English government, agreed to adopt all of the recommendations from the Climate Change Council, except one, which was that they would not reduce livestock numbers in order to meet to reduce methane emissions. They said, we're not going to do that. That's not what we're doing in Scotland. And I think that comes down to a culture thing. Obviously, it's a reflection of the government in place at the moment, and it's probably a more conservative government. But I think as well, anyone who knows a Scot knows they are very proud to be Scottish. They hold on to their identity really strongly. If you've ever been to a Scotland versus England rugby game or seen it, you will completely understand anything that sets them apart from England. Their brand is important to them, and they have a very long history of agriculture. I mean, I'm making generalizations here, but my take on it is that whilst it is definitely a political decision, that decision not to reduce livestock numbers to reduce emissions, as per the recommendation, actually links to culture, because if you are reducing livestock in places where you can't do anything else but graze animals, then you're impacting those communities that live in those areas, and then you're going to be impacting culture. So I find whilst we live in different contexts and we live in different regions and parts of the world, there's some similarities that really influence how we do what we do. So these are just some little did you knows that I thought I'd throw in. I've already talked about the Australian Carbon Credit Unit scheme and the scientific rigour behind it. But did you know that there are 81 carbon calculators globally? And the other interesting thing about that is that globally, or actually whichever two you use, if you use a couple of different calculators and put the same data into them, they won't necessarily spit the same data out. So always use the same carbon calculator. It's not to say one's right or wrong. They just use different parameters within the modelling, which, if you're interested, I do cover some of that in my report, which there's a link to at the end of this. And I talked about the Vera and the gold standard as well. So I touched on this before. We're actually not that different in Australia to anyone else in the world. I'll let you read some of these, but you can probably understand and associate with a lot of these. How can we sell what we can't see to someone we'll never meet in regards to carbon markets? Farmers should be rewarded for looking after the environment. If I can get a price premium, then I'll do the work. This is nothing groundbreaking, but the thing is, it's actually relevant globally, and that's a little comforting, because while we are feeling confused in Australia, so are a lot of other people, and I also think that there's lots of programs in Australia where we can have opportunities to learn, and so I think that we should make the most of that. So I've put some resources up here. One of there's a shout out to LLS. I've got your link to your Natural Capital and Carbon Farming website. My report is Tracking Carbon on Farm Good for Business, was released in April this year. It's on the Nuffield Australia website under the report section. You can search by country and by year. You should be able to find it if you're interested. The Carbon Market Institute recently this year released the Landholder Guidance, a checklist for partnering on carbon farming projects. It's quite lengthy and it's quite detailed, but it's a useful resource. And I mentioned the paper earlier about how rotational grazing can improve soil organic carbon, and I've got a link to that here as well. So I think that was about it. I think, Razak, hopefully that was useful or interesting. I think this is something that there is no quick answer for. There's no silver bullet. I think education is the best thing you can do if you're looking at how you can engage. I'm more than happy for people to contact me if they've got questions. I can't guarantee that I'll answer them, but I might be able to point you in the right direction. And I know Local Land Services also have a really good team of people on staff who will do their best to help out in this sort of topic as well. So I will stop sharing my screen, and over to you, Razak.
Oh, thanks, Pippa. That was very interesting. So engaging and so broad topic, so interesting. So yeah, so very interesting topic. And I was just kind of imagining the stuff you're talking about, traveling around the world and trying to understand what they're doing and get those knowledge for us. So yeah, so we'll jump on to the questions like Q&A section. Now,
I see Emma's, there's a question in there around which country did I find most interesting? That's a really good question. I think Vietnam was the most interesting for me, and maybe because it is so different to what I know. So from a standard of living point of view, from a farm point of view, from a government point of view, I think it just really, I felt like going to those countries that were different. So Uruguay and Vietnam, as opposed to North America or the UK or even Australia. I think it just pushes your perceptions and pushes your thinking and makes you ask questions that maybe you wouldn't otherwise ask. So and recognise that what we see as an issue in Australia is tenfold in other places of the world, or isn't even on their radar in other places of the world.
yep. Thank you for that one, Pip. So we're maybe people are still thinking what question they can ask. So because this is such an interesting and new topic, but I got I got two questions for you actually. So I'm really interested to know more about these. So what are the challenges in Australia to engage farmers in carbon farming?
Oh, that's a really good one, and I don't know if I've got how I can answer that. I think the challenge is that we talk about low emissions agriculture without always making a really clear link to productivity and profitability. It's seen as an added extra often, or it's seen as something that I don't know where to start. And so the challenge is that whatever programs or technologies or initiatives or research that are being delivered and developed, the challenge is always making that link back to the bottom line.
Yep.
Because that's when we get farmers engaging.
Yeah, cool. That's awesome. So I think I will ask my next question after. So we got a question from Keith. Can you see that, Pip?
Yes, I can. Hi, Keith.
Awesome.
Yes. I'm not sure if they're stacking, but so the question is around Matador Ranch, who are also doing some biodiversity projects on farm. So they are definitely looking at how can they improve biodiversity. And the example that I talked about, I saw when I was over there, was looking at a riparian project and improving habitat for endangered fish. So they're definitely acknowledging and undertaking projects that improve biodiversity alongside those carbon markets, which is really important. And I often sort of say, people sometimes say to me, it's not always about carbon, it's about the bigger picture. I know I've worked in NRM for 17 years. I know that, but we're just getting so much information at us about carbon that I figured it would be an interesting topic. But yeah, definitely, that was a good question, Keith. Hopefully I answered that for you.
Yep. Thank you. Sorry, I missed the question from Naomi. So I can read this out for you. Thanks, Pippa. You have been delivering these presentations for a while now. Have you noticed a shift in the baseline knowledge of the audience over the time as a carbon farming has become a more general topic of discussion and interest?
Thanks. That's a good question too, Naomi. Yeah, and I'm sure I know some of you on this line have seen me present before, so hopefully I do try and change it up each time, and hopefully provide something new and interesting. But I have to say, I assume that there is a base level of understanding, because sometimes I feel like I'm saying this stuff and am I teaching you all how to suck eggs? But then I will talk to a farmer and I'm always a bit surprised that that base level of knowledge isn't there. And I think we really need to be careful that we don't assume that it is, because there's a whole part of the farming community that just don't have that. And they won't be the people that call into these webinars. They'll be the ones that engage differently.
Yep. Awesome. Thanks, Pip. Got another question from Alison. Alison Young from Northern Slopes Land Care. So, which country did you believe had a more focused system of sustainability?
I think sustainability probably means different things to different parts of the world. The UK had like the Sustainable Farming Incentive, which was a government program being rolled out, as I said, so they could understand or engage, get funding to do works on farm to improve biodiversity and production. However, with that comes the administrative burden of having a subsidy system, which I don't necessarily think is something, well, I know it's not something we want in Australia, and I'm not really sure is an approach that I'd be comfortable with. So I think it's all in context, right? Yes, the UK has a lot of high, and the EU, a lot of higher standards and around sustainability and maybe programs to address that. However, they also have administrative burden to go with that. Whereas I think in Australia, we're quite unique in that we don't largely have subsidy systems, and I think we've had to be, we are by and large innovators because we have to be, because of our climate. And so I think some of the programs that we deliver in Australia are up there.
Yep, awesome. Thanks, Pip. So now I can jump on my question actually. So I keep getting many thoughts and questions for you. So my next question is, what are the carbon calculators people are using in Australia? So what are like?
Yeah, there's quite a few carbon calculators in Australia, which are all modelled off. A lot of you would be familiar with Richard Eckhart from the University of Melbourne, developed the GAF tool, the Greenhouse Accounting Framework, and so the Australian carbon calculators are based on that. But again, like I said, same information in, different information out often, regardless of the fact they're based on the same model. I've used several of the carbon calculators. I think the one that I prefer to use is the Agricultural Innovation Australia, AIA. It's called the EAP, which is the Environmental Accounting Platform. It's essentially a carbon calculator. It was funded by all of the RDCs in Australia, so the GRDC, MLA, CRDC, Wine Australia, all of them contributed to develop this one. So it is quite, I just find it a good one to use, and so that's probably my go-to.
Yep, awesome. Sounds great. Thank you. And another question, like if any farmer or anyone wants to participate in the carbon farming program, so what are the first step they has to take? They have to take.
That's a, oh God, I feel like all I say is that's a really good question, which is just my code for saying I just need an extra 10 seconds to think about how I'm going to answer this. Let's be honest. I think the first thing I would do is I would work out what my goals and my vision is for my farm, because I think every context is different. So just because my neighbour has signed up to a soil carbon project, for example, doesn't mean, and he's got the same climate, he has the same soils, we're both graziers, doesn't mean it's going to work for me. Or just because I decide that I'm going to start measuring, using the AIA calculator to measure my carbon footprint every year, because I've got time and I've got the ability, doesn't mean that the neighbour on the other fence is going to. So I think being clear about what you need, what you want on farm and more broadly in the longer term, can really help set up some of those guide rails as to the decisions you make and the actions you take, because you'll get a fairly good understanding of what your risk appetite is, whether a carbon a project may or may not be within that risk appetite. But I also think it's about talking to your advisors. So whether that's your agronomist, whether that's your local land services staff member, whether that's your banker, your accountant. I think it is about learning, and it is about knowledge, and it is not about quick decisions and a fast buck. So I think me, who is one of the most impatient people in the world, it is about being patient and trying just to understand as best you can, and surrounding yourself with advice, but being very clear on how that links to your long-term goal.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Pip. On the advisor, so in LLS we have got natural capital advisor. So if you have any question, would like to know more, you can reach out to our advisor for more information. And for Northwest local land services, so we have Andrew Jack as a natural capital advisor. So you can reach out to him if you have any question about natural capital or carbon farming. So he will be the person in LLS who can, in Northwest LLS, so he can provide you with more information. So I think so we haven't got any other question at this moment. I think people are still thinking, and I think you will get more question, and people will email you, I hope, or they have got your contact details. They will maybe give you a call or send you an email with their questions. I think yep. So so I will do the post event survey now. So it will come up on your screen in a sec.
Well, this is the nervous part. This is the survey where the presenter actually gets to see the results. So don't let that make you change your judgment, everyone.
Thank you everyone for your time completing the post-event survey. So we put together the information in a fact sheet, the key points that Pippa presented today. So we'll send out the fact sheet with all the links and things that Pippa has presented today, and you will have that in your mailbox in your email shortly after this presentation, after this webinar. And yeah, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions about this. So we have our next webinar happening at the same time next Wednesday. So feel free to join us for that webinar as well. I think we have got John Welsh from AgEcon, who will be talking about biodiversity credits and opportunity for biodiversity market participation next week. So I hope I will see you in next webinar. Thank you, and I think we'll also email you this recorded version of this webinar today, and you'll also find this find this recorded version on our YouTube channel as well. Thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.